quilt was the first thing I noticed. Not the bed, not the lamp, not the man standing across the room, the quilt, stitched by hands that had been making quilts since before I was born, laid out in colors that were supposed to mean welcome. I remember staring at it and thinking, this is the last ordinary object I will look at before everything changes. I didn't know yet how right that thought would turn out to be, just not in the way I imagined. I was 19, he was 23. We'd shared maybe 24 real conversations in our whole lives, most of them in front of other people, most of them about weather or harvest, or which family was hosting church next. That night was supposed to be the beginning of something neither of us had been given a single real word to describe. So we walked into it the way you walk into a dark room you've been told is safe. Slowly, hands out, hoping not to hit anything sharp. I'll keep this part short because what happened that night isn't really the story. What happened in the 2 weeks after is the story. So I'll just say this, it hurt more than anyone had prepared me for. It ended quickly, and afterward I lay in the dark next to a sleeping man and felt something I couldn't name and didn't dare ask about. Before I go further, quick pause, my name's Rachel. This is Quiet Harvest, and if stories like this one matter to you, hit subscribe, because there's a lot more underneath this particular silence than one night could ever cover. And I want you to sit with a question while you listen. Who exactly taught you about your own body? Not the diagrams in a school textbook, not a doctor's clinical rundown. I mean, who actually sat across from you and said, here's what's normal, here's what isn't, here's what to do if something feels wrong. If someone did that for you, you got something rare. Most of the women I grew up with never did. In the world I was raised in, a woman's body wasn't exactly hidden, but it also wasn't exactly hers to understand. It belonged eventually to a husband, and before that, to modesty, and before that, to God. At least that's how it was explained to me in the handful of vague sentences anyone ever bothered to offer. Nobody stood up in church and said it outright. There was no rule taped to a wall. It was just woven into everything. The way you can tell a fence is electrified without ever touching it, just by watching how the cattle stay clear of it. I think about my mother's voice the week before the wedding. She sat me down at the kitchen table, the same table I'd done my schoolwork on as a child, and she gave me exactly 9 words. He'll be gentle if you let him be. 9 words, and then she got up to check the bread. That was the entirety of what I was handed. My older cousin Esther, married 3 years by then, told me something a little longer, maybe a sentence and a half, about how the first time is supposed to feel different from every time after. I asked her different how. She looked at me the way you look at someone asking a question you're not allowed to answer, and she said, you'll understand once it's behind you. Nobody lied to me. I want to be clear about that. Nobody sat me down and told me something false. They just told me almost nothing at all, and let me fill in the rest with guesswork and fear, and the vague comfort of believing that whatever I felt, every woman before me had felt the same thing and survived it. My husband, for what it's worth, knew even less than I did. I used to think that was impossible, that surely the men were taught something the women weren't. They weren't. If anything, what little instruction existed was aimed entirely at us, at the women, about modesty and patience and submission, and the men were simply expected to arrive at the moment and figure it out through instinct, like it was something that came factory installed. It didn't. He told me later, years later, that he'd spent the weeks before the wedding more terrified than excited, convinced he was going to do something wrong and never be told what it was. So that's who we were, 2 people raised inside the same silence, standing in a room with 1 lamp and a sleeping farm dog somewhere outside the window, both of us holding a key to a door neither of us had been shown how to open. What happened that night was fast, and it was painful, and it was over before either of us really understood what had occurred. He apologized afterward more than once, in a voice that sounded younger than I'd ever heard it. I told him it was fine. I believed that when I said it, I had nothing to compare it to. If someone tells you the ocean is supposed to taste like salt, and then you taste salt water for the first time and it burns your throat a little, you don't necessarily think something's wrong. You think, I suppose this is what salt water tastes like. He fell asleep within minutes. I lay there a long time, listening to a barn cat yowling somewhere outside, watching the lamp burn lower, and feeling something warm pooling beneath me that I assumed, in my exhaustion and confusion, was simply part of what the night was supposed to involve. I told myself, this is what Esther meant. This is the part you understand once it's behind you. It was not behind me. Not even close. It was, in fact, only just beginning. By morning, there was more than I expected. I told myself it would slow by afternoon. It didn't. By the second day I started doing math in my head, counting backward to make sure I hadn't miscounted my own cycle, trying to convince myself this was some strange overlap of timing, and not something else. By the fourth day, the math stopped helping. By the seventh day, I was washing cloths in the basin behind the house before dawn. So no one in his family would see, telling myself that surely, someone would have warned me if this wasn't supposed to happen. I didn't tell my husband for the better part of a week, not because I didn't trust him, but because I genuinely did not have language for what was happening to my own body, and admitting something was wrong felt like admitting I'd done something wrong, even though I couldn't have told you what that something was. We were raised to believe that whatever happened in a marriage bed stayed sealed inside it, the way you seal a jar of preserves, tightly, permanently, and without much ceremony. He noticed before I said anything. Of course he did. We were sharing a bed. He asked, gently, almost afraid of the question itself, if I was all right. I told him I was fine, and here's the thing that took me years to understand without bitterness: he believed me, not because he didn't care, but because he had no frame of reference that would have told him my answer didn't make sense. He'd been given the exact same nothing I had. We were both fluent in a language made entirely of silence, and neither of us could translate what my body was actually saying. By the 10th day, I was lightheaded, standing up too fast. By the 12th, my hands had started trembling without any cold to explain it. It was his mother, finally, who noticed the color had gone out of my face at breakfast, who asked a question with enough weight behind it that I couldn't deflect it with fine. She didn't say much, she just looked at me for a long moment, the way you look at a sky that's about to turn, and she said quietly, "That's not normal, child. Not after this many days." Those 5 words did more for me than anything anyone had said in the entire lead-up to my wedding. Not normal. Someone had finally named the thing. By day 14, I was in the back of a buggy headed toward a clinic 2 towns over. My mother-in-law beside me, her jaw set in a way I'd never seen, like she was furious at something but not entirely sure where to aim it yet. The doctor who saw me was patient and direct, and within 20 minutes, using words I had genuinely never heard strung together in that order before, explained that what I'd experienced wasn't an unusually intense version of normal. It was a tear that hadn't been properly addressed, made worse by 2 weeks of normal daily movement, made worse by no one having told me that bleeding past a few days meant something needed attention, not patience. I remember sitting on the exam table feeling 2 things at once, and they didn't cancel each other out. They just sat there together, heavy and contradictory. Relief, because someone had finally explained what was happening to me in terms I could actually hold on to. And grief, because the explanation came 2 weeks late. And 2 weeks is a long time to bleed while believing your own discomfort doesn't count as something worth mentioning. The drive home was quiet. My mother-in-law didn't say much, but at one point she reached over and held my hand the rest of the way, and I understood that wasn't nothing. That was, in its own limited and complicated way, an apology for a silence she hadn't created but had absolutely inherited and passed forward without meaning to. My husband cried when I told him what the doctor said. Not because he'd done anything wrong on purpose, he hadn't, but because he realized the same way I had, that we'd both walked into the most intimate moment of our young lives carrying nothing but instinct and fear, and that the people who loved us most had handed us that nothing as if it were a gift instead of an absence. We sat on the porch steps that evening, not really talking, just leaning against each other, 2 people quietly grieving an education neither of us had ever been allowed to have. I want to be careful here, because I know how easy it is to tell a story like this and let it curdle into something that sounds like blame aimed at everyone who raised me. That's not what this is. My mother gave me 9 words because 9 words were what she'd been given. Esther gave me a sentence and a half because that's what survived being passed down to her. Nobody in my life handed me silence out of cruelty. They handed it to me because it was the only inheritance available, polished smooth by generations of women who'd convinced themselves that not talking was its own kind of protection. And there were real good things inside that life too. I'm not going to pretend otherwise just because this story is about something painful. There was a kind of belonging in that community that I have never found anywhere else since. Neighbors who'd show up unannounced with a wagon full of food if your barn burned down, a whole congregation that would rebuild your roof before you'd finished asking. There was a rhythm to the seasons that felt like being held by something larger than any one family. I don't say any of that to soften what happened to me. I say it because both things are true at once, and pretending one of them isn't real doesn't make the other one any more honest. It took me almost 3 years to fully understand what had actually happened to my body that first night, and how differently things might have gone if even one person had said, "Here is what's normal, and here is what means you need help." Not because the people around me were withholding cruelty on purpose, but because nobody had ever said it to them either. It's strange the way silence can travel through a family like that, generation after generation. Each woman believing she's sparing the next one some shame, when really she's just handing forward a gap shaped exactly like the one she fell into herself. I left that community a few years later, for reasons that are a whole other story I'll tell another time, and one of the very first things I did once I was somewhere with a library and an internet connection was sit alone in a room and read everything I could find about what had actually happened to me that night. Not because I needed it explained twice. I needed to see it written down in plain, unembarrassed language, the kind nobody around me growing up had ever been willing to use. I needed proof that what happened to me had a name, that it wasn't some personal failure of patience or toughness, that an actual injury had occurred and gone unspoken for far too long simply because nobody had given either of us the words to recognize it. Here's what I wish someone had told both of us before that night, and what I'd want any young person stepping into a similar room to hear now. Pain that lingers isn't a personality trait you're supposed to develop a tolerance for. Bleeding that goes on for days isn't proof of how much you can endure. Discomfort is not on its own evidence of anything except that something deserves attention. If something feels wrong, the correct response is never silence dressed up as patience. The correct response is a question, asked out loud to someone who actually knows the answer. And to anyone listening who grew up the way I did, inside a quiet so total you didn't even recognize it as a quiet until you were standing outside of it, I want you to hear this clearly. You weren't given those instincts because you were weak or naive. You were given exactly what was handed to you, which was almost nothing, dressed up to look like enough. That's not a flaw in you. That's a flaw in what was passed down. There's a difference between never being told and never being capable of understanding. And for years I confused the two, and I don't want you carrying that same confusion a single day longer than I did. My husband and I are still married, all these years later, and we talk about that night sometimes now, openly, the way two adults talk about something that happened to both of them rather than something one of them caused. He still apologizes sometimes, even now, and I tell him the same thing every time. You didn't do this, the silence did. We were just the two people standing closest to it when it finally broke. If this story landed somewhere in you, I'd love to know. Tell me, even in just a word or two, what stuck with you, and if you've got your own version of this, your own 2-week silence, your own 9 words from a parent who didn't have any more to give, I want to hear that too, because I think there are more of us out there than anyone admits, and the only way that changes is if we stop treating our own bodies like something too private to even understand. There's a lot more to this story than one night and one bleeding clock ticking down in the back of my mind. There's the leaving, eventually, and what came after that, and what it cost, and what it gave back. I'm going to tell all of it, piece by piece, here on this channel. So stay close. Subscribe if you haven't, because this is only the beginning of what I have to say, and I'm not finished yet. Your body was never something you were supposed to silently survive. It was always supposed to be something you understood.